Welcome, my friend. I'm glad you're here. Tonight, you're safe. You can rest now. All you need to do is lie back, breathe slowly, and let the world grow quiet around you. In this bedtime story, I'll take you on a peaceful journey through the early history of the United States, from untouched wilderness to the first brave settlers to a new nation discovering its destiny. There will be no rush, no stress, no loud moments. Just a calm, gentle retelling, steady as a heartbeat, soft as candlelight, guiding your mind away from the noise of the day and into deep, restful sleep. If you enjoy relaxing stories like this, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and tap the bell, so you'll always have a companion on sleepless nights. Now, allow your eyes to soften, feel your breath slow down, let your body grow heavy and warm. With each moment, you are drifting deeper into calm. When you're ready, we'll begin Chapter 1, and together, we'll travel back to a time before borders, before flags, before history had written the name America. Rest easy, the story is about to begin. Before there were borders, before there were flags, before the word America existed at all, there was a vast and silent continent, a land untouched by Europe, a world of endless forests, towering mountains, rolling plains, and rivers that carved their paths long before history was ever written. For thousands of years, this land was home to the First Nations of North America. Not one tribe, not one language, not one story, but many. A tapestry of civilizations, hunters of the northern ice, farmers of the woodlands, horsemen of the plains, builders of desert cities, carved from sun and stone. They lived differently. They spoke differently. They worshipped differently. Yet across the continent, they shared a common truth. The land was sacred. Life moved with the seasons. Territory was remembered in stories, not lines on a map. Trade flowed by river and trail. Knowledge traveled farther than armies ever could. Villages rose, councils met, children learned by the fire, and each generation passed its wisdom to the next. This was a continent alive with rhythm and meaning. Balanced, rooted, unconquered. To the people who lived here, this world was complete. Whole, home. But across the ocean, everything was changing. Kingdoms fought for power. Empires searched for wealth. Ships grew stronger. Maps grew wider. And curiosity grew dangerous. Europe hungered for more land, more gold, more glory. Soon, sails would rise on the Atlantic horizon. Soon, strangers would arrive carrying new beliefs, new weapons, new diseases, and new ambitions. They did not know this land. They did not understand its people. Yet they would claim it all the same. The untouched world stood at the edge of a storm. History was coming, and nothing would ever be the same. Across the Atlantic, another world was stirring. Europe was changing. Kingdoms were rising. Trade was expanding. Ambition was growing faster than borders could contain. Gold, spices, silk, power. These were the obsessions of the age. Ships pushed beyond familiar shores. Maps no longer stopped at the edge of the known world. And the ocean, once feared, became a highway of possibility. Among the dreamers and gamblers of this era stood a sailor from Genoa. His name would echo through centuries: Christopher Columbus. He believed that by sailing west, he could reach the riches of Asia. He was wrong about the destination, but his mistake would change history forever. In 1492, with Spanish backing, Columbus crossed a vast and hostile ocean. Storms battered his ships. Fear stalked his crew. Mutiny whispered in the dark. Then land. The New World. Islands of the Caribbean. Homes of the Taino and other native peoples. Civilizations that had lived in balance with these shores long before Europe dreamed of them. Columbus claimed the land for Spain. More ships followed. More soldiers. More flags. More hunger. The age of discovery had begun. But discovery for one civilization would become disaster for another. Spain seized gold and territory. France explored the cold rivers of Canada, and England, watching from across the sea, prepared to make its move. This contest for empire would decide the fate of a continent. It would also plant the first fragile seeds of what would one day become the United States. And England's true beginning in the New World would not be a triumph, but a struggle for survival. A settlement called Jamestown was waiting on the horizon. England wanted its claim, a foothold, a beginning. In 1607, they chose a stretch of swampy Virginia soil and called it Jamestown. 3 small ships carried them across the ocean, full of dreams, full of ambition, and almost completely unprepared. They expected wealth. They expected triumph. They expected a new life of promise. What they found was a fight for basic survival. The land was harsh. The water was salty. Mosquitoes filled the air. Crops refused to grow. Winter came early. Disease came sooner. The settlers built a wooden fort, but they could not build enough food. They searched for gold, though what they needed was grain, shelter, and clean water. Then came the darkest season of all the starving time. During the winter of 1609 to 1610, Jamestown collapsed into hunger. Supplies ran out. Men grew too weak to stand. Some lost hope. Many lost their lives. Only a fraction survived the cold. And yet, the colony did not disappear. In this struggling outpost, an uneasy relationship formed with the Powhatan Confederacy, led by Chief Powhatan. Trade, tension, peace, conflict, a delicate balance, shifting like wind through the trees. Amid this fragile moment, a young woman's name would cross into legend: Pocahontas. Not the romantic tale later imagined, but a story of diplomacy, of small mercies, and of fragile understanding between two worlds. Still, survival did not come from diplomacy alone. Jamestown finally found its lifeline in a single crop: tobacco. John Rolfe planted a sweeter strain, and the soil answered. Tobacco would spread, fortunes would rise, and Jamestown would endure. But with profit came a shadow. Plantations demanded labor, and in 1619, the first enslaved Africans were brought to Virginia. A seed of prosperity had been planted, and a seed of tragedy as well. Jamestown survived. Jamestown remained. It was the first English footprint on a long road that would lead, step by step, toward a new nation. But if Jamestown was the lesson in hardship, the next chapter would bring something different: a story of faith, winter, and unshakable belief. Ahead lay a small ship called the Mayflower, and a colony named Plymouth. Not all who crossed the Atlantic came for gold. Some came for God, for freedom of worship, for a home where conscience could not be ordered by a king. These were the Pilgrims. In 1620, they boarded a small, aging ship called the Mayflower and sailed toward uncertainty. The ocean punished them for weeks. Storms broke their sleep. Waves tossed their hopes. Families huddled in darkness, holding tightly to faith and to one another. Yet, they endured. When land finally appeared, it was not Virginia. They were far to the north, on the rocky shores of New England. Cold, gray, unforgiving, but they made a choice. They would stay. Before stepping onto the frozen coast, they made a document, a simple covenant, an agreement that would echo through American history: the Mayflower Compact, a promise of self-government by consent of the governed, not by royal decree, not by distant parliament, but by the community itself. It was a spark, small but powerful. Then came winter, and winter was merciless. Shelters were weak, food was scarce, cold pierced bone and spirit. Illness moved through the camp like a silent thief. By spring, half the Pilgrims were gone. But those who survived did not surrender. They planted, they rebuilt, they prayed. And help arrived from those who knew the land best. Squanto, a Patuxet man, taught them how to plant corn in the stubborn soil. He showed them where to fish and how to endure New England's brutal seasons. An alliance formed with the Wampanoag under Massasoit. Not a perfect peace, not a permanent peace, but a lifeline. And from this fragile hope came a moment of gratitude, a harvest celebration that Americans would one day call Thanksgiving. Plymouth did not grow fast, it did not grow rich, but it grew strong in spirit. It proved that a colony could survive on belief, on community, and on self-rule. Jamestown had built the economic root. Plymouth planted the ideological one. Together, these two colonies, so different in purpose, were shaping the foundation of a future nation. But their destinies were no longer their own. Across the coastline, more settlements were rising. 13 English colonies were beginning to form. 13 beliefs, 13 identities, 13 futures. And soon they would collide, struggle, and eventually unite against the empire that raised them. As the years passed, the English presence on the Atlantic coast multiplied. One colony became two, two became many. And soon, 13 colonies lined the eastern edge of North America. They shared a king. They spoke the same language, but they did not share the same world. Each colony grew with its own purpose, its own rhythm, its own identity. New England. In the north, the land was rocky, the winters harsh, and survival demanded discipline. New England became a region of town halls, church steeples, schools, and tight-knit communities. Here, faith ran deep, and self-government took root early. Work was worship. Education was duty. Morality was law. The middle colonies, to the mid-Atlantic, diversity arrived from the start. Different languages, different beliefs, different dreams. Trade flourished in bustling ports like New York and Philadelphia. Here, compromise became a habit. Tolerance became a necessity. Commerce became a way of life. The southern colonies. In the south, the soil was rich, the rivers wide, and plantations spread across vast fields. Tobacco, rice, indigo, cash crops shaped southern destiny. Wealth rose for a few, while the labor of many, including enslaved Africans, built an economy of staggering contradiction. Prosperity and injustice grew side by side. 13 worlds, one coast. By the mid-1700s, the colonies were thriving. Villages became towns. Towns became cities. Trade routes expanded. Libraries opened. Ideas moved faster than ships. But beneath the progress, a quiet tension formed. These 13 colonies were English, yet they were also becoming something else, something new, something different. A new identity was forming. Not British, not European, but American. And across the ocean, in palaces and parliaments, Britain saw the colonies not as partners, but as possessions. The empire wanted obedience. The colonies wanted respect. Ahead lay conflict not just of armies, but of ideas. The question was no longer can the colonies survive. They had. The question becoming impossible to ignore was, who are we, and who has the right to rule us? The answer to that question would ignite a revolution. And one night, in a port called Boston, the first spark would fall. Victory in war is never free. After defeating France in the 7 Years' War, Britain stood triumphant, but buried under debt. To London, the answer seemed simple. The colonies must pay. The colonies, however, saw something very different. Taxation without representation. The policies that sparked a fire. Britain passed new laws from across the ocean. The Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts. Taxes on paper, on tea, on goods used every day. But the colonists had no voice in Parliament. No seat, no vote, no say. They were subjects of the crown, but citizens of nowhere. Voices rose in protest. Pamphlets spread through taverns and streets. The colonies began to speak with one anger, even if not yet with one voice. No taxation without representation. This became their cry, their line in the sand, their declaration that rights did not end where the Atlantic began. Britain answered with new restrictions. More taxes, more troops, more control. The relationship between colony and crown was cracking like ice in spring. The Boston Massacre 1770. Tension finally bled into violence. British soldiers, surrounded by angry colonists, fired into a crowd. 5 colonists fell. The news raced across the colonies, painted in ink and outrage. Fear grew. Distrust hardened. The road to rebellion became shorter. The Tea Act, 1773. Britain made one final mistake, small in policy, huge in consequence. They gave a monopoly on tea, forcing colonists to buy only from one company. It was not the price that enraged the colonies, it was the principle. And in Boston, patience finally snapped. The Boston Tea Party. On a cold December night in 1773, colonists disguised as Mohawk warriors boarded British ships and dumped 342 chests of tea into the harbor. Not theft, not looting, but a message to London that could not be ignored. Tea floated in the moonlit water, and an empire trembled. The turning tide. Britain responded with fury, closing Boston's port, tightening control, and punishing Massachusetts. But instead of breaking the colonies, Britain united them. From Georgia to New Hampshire, a new idea began to spread. We must stand together. For the first time, the 13 colonies began to look at one another, not as strangers, but as allies. Not as separate provinces, but as a shared cause. The tide was turning. The fuse was lit. Revolution was no longer unthinkable. It was inevitable. And very soon, leaders would gather in Philadelphia to decide the fate of a continent. Ahead lay the birth of a nation and the storm of war. By 1774, the crisis could not be ignored. Britain had punished Boston, closed its harbor, and tightened its grip. If the colonies did nothing, Boston would fall alone. And after Boston, each colony would fall in turn. So for the first time, leaders from across North America traveled to a single meeting place, Philadelphia. 13 colonies, 13 delegations, 13 different interests, but one urgent purpose. They gathered at Carpenter's Hall, in what would be known as the First Continental Congress. 13 voices. The room was filled with men of sharp minds and sharper tempers. From Massachusetts, fiery voices demanding firm resistance. From Pennsylvania and New York, merchants seeking peace, fearful of losing trade. From the South, planters wary of British taxes, but cautious of rebellion. They did not agree, not at first. Some feared war. Some feared surrender. All feared the consequences. But slowly, through debate and determination, a truth emerged. If they did not unite, they would not survive. A step toward union. The Congress made a decision, not yet a declaration of independence, but a declaration of resolve. They agreed to stand together against British oppression. They organized a boycott of British goods. They called for colonial militias to prepare for danger, and they pledged that an attack on one colony would be treated as an attack on all. A new idea was being born, not just protest, but American solidarity. The king refuses to listen. They sent a message to King George III, urging him to see reason. They asked for dignity, for rights, for representation. But the king did not bend. He did not compromise. He did not negotiate. He prepared for force. And with that choice, the door to peace began to close. The point of no return. The Congress adjourned, but the colonies did not calm. They drilled militias on fields and village greens. They stored powder and shot. They waited for the spark they knew would come. Not months later, but only a few miles outside Boston, that spark would ignite gunfire heard around the world. The time for talk was ending. The time for revolution was about to begin. The British believed the colonies would never fight. They believed the rebellion was noise, ink on paper, anger in taverns, nothing more. So in April of 1775, British troops marched out of Boston with a quiet confidence. Their orders were simple: seize colonial weapons in Concord, arrest patriot leaders, break the movement before it became a revolution. But whispers travel faster than armies. Riders spread the alarm through villages and farms. The most famous among them, Paul Revere. He rode through the night, calling out a warning that would echo through history. The British are coming. Lexington. At sunrise, British soldiers reached the village green of Lexington. Waiting for them stood a small group of colonial militia, ordinary farmers, shopkeepers, blacksmiths, men with families and fear in their eyes. They were outnumbered, outmatched, but they stood their ground. No one knows who fired first. A single shot cracked through the morning air, a moment of sound that shattered an empire. Chaos followed. Smoke, shouts, gunfire. The Revolutionary War had begun. Concord. The British marched on to Concord, but now the countryside was awake. Militia fighters, the Minutemen, poured in from every direction. At Concord's North Bridge, the colonists did what few believed possible. They forced the British to retreat. For the first time, an imperial army was pushed back by its own subjects. The march back to Boston became a gauntlet of ambush and fire. From behind rocks, trees, and stone walls, the colonists attacked and vanished, attacked and vanished. The British reached Boston exhausted, shaken, and forever changed. A new reality. There was no turning back now. The colonies had taken up arms. The king would answer with force. The empire would march to war. But the world had heard the echo of that first mysterious shot. It was more than a musket blast. It was a message. A people are willing to fight for their own future. 13 colonies had crossed the threshold of history. Ahead stood blood, sacrifice, and impossible odds, but also a dream larger than fear. The fight for independence had begun in earnest. And soon the colonies would gather again in Philadelphia, not just to resist, but to declare a new nation. War had begun, but the colonies had no army, no command, no uniforms, no navy, no treasury. Just militias. Brave but scattered, fighting as neighbors, not as a nation. If the colonies were to survive, they needed a leader. Someone steady, someone respected, someone who could unite 13 fractious colonies into a single fighting force. In June of 1775, at the Second Continental Congress, they made their choice. They turned to a tall Virginian, with quiet eyes, a soldier's posture, and a reputation for discipline. George Washington. A reluctant commander, Washington did not beg for command. He did not chase glory. He accepted the role with humility and a deep, private fear. He knew how impossible the task would be. Washington took charge of men who owned no matching coats, who lacked gunpowder and boots, and who sometimes brought their own muskets from home. This was not an army. Not yet. But he would make one. The birth of the Continental Army under Washington, militiamen became soldiers. He demanded order. He demanded training. He demanded unity. He rode among the ranks, speaking little, observing everything. He worked to instill belief not in him, but in the cause. He knew one truth above all. Britain could win every battle on the field and still lose the war if America refused to quit. This was how a nation would fight. Not for pay, not for empire, but for an idea. Bunker Hill. Fire and resolve. In Boston, Washington inherited an army already bloodied but unbroken. At Bunker Hill, the colonists had stood against British regulars, and though they lost the ground, they proved a shocking point. They could face the empire and make it bleed. This was more than a battle. It was a warning. Britain might hold the cities, Britain might command the seas, but the Americans would not bow. A war of endurance. Washington understood something few generals ever grasp. He did not have to defeat Britain. He only had to outlast it. Keep the army alive. Keep the cause alive. Keep hope alive. His weapon was not strength. It was endurance. And so, under his command, the Continental Army became more than troops in uniform. It became a symbol, a heartbeat, a promise that the colonies were ready to stand as one people, whatever the cost. The road ahead. The war was just beginning. Ahead waited loss, retreat, sacrifice, and moments when the revolution would teeter on the edge of collapse. But for the first time, the colonies had an army, and an army had a leader. The world had taken notice. The empire had been challenged. The fight for independence was now fully underway. And soon, the colonies would take the next step, not just to resist, but to declare what they truly intended to be. By 1776, the colonies had reached a crossroads from which there was no safe return. They had fought, they had bled, they had buried their dead, but they were still in name and law British. How long could they fight a king while still calling him their ruler? The time for half measures had passed. The time for clarity had come. The Continental Congress meets again. Delegates gathered in Philadelphia under summer heat and the weight of history. They argued. They doubted. They feared the gallows that surely awaited them if they failed. Independence was treason. Treason meant death. But staying loyal meant surrender. From this tension, one idea rose above all others. We must become a nation. Not rebels, not colonies. A nation. The pen of Thomas Jefferson. A committee was formed. Among them stood a young Virginian with talent for language and a mind sharpened by philosophy. Thomas Jefferson. With quill in hand, he wrote through the night. Draft after draft, thought after thought, line after line. He wrote of rights that did not come from kings or parliaments or armies, but from the Creator himself. Life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. These were not laws. They were principles. Principles that no government had the right to take away. The 4th of July, 1776, Congress debated the document, edited it, fought over it. Then, at last, they approved it. The colonies declared, not with muskets, but with words, that they were free and independent states. The moment was quiet. No trumpets, no fireworks, just signatures on parchment. But the echo of that moment would carry farther than any cannon ever fired. A new identity. From that day forward, they no longer fought as subjects of Britain, but as Americans. The Declaration of Independence did not end the war. It did not bring peace. It did not guarantee victory. But it gave the struggle its soul. It told the world what America stood for. And it told Americans why they must endure. The revolution now had a voice, a purpose, a destiny. But words alone could not win freedom. Ahead lay battlefields still soaked in fear and smoke, armies still to face, and a winter that would test the very spirit of this newborn nation. The ink was dry, the die was cast, the world had changed, and the war was about to grow darker. Independence was declared. But declarations do not win wars. By late 1776 and 1777, the American Revolution stood on a knife's edge. Washington's army was hungry, poorly clothed, constantly retreating and fighting an empire that seemed unstoppable. The dream of liberty was alive, but it flickered in the wind. The revolution needed help, not sympathy, not applause, allies. And across the Atlantic, one nation watched with growing interest. France. Old enemies, new opportunities. France had not forgotten its bitter defeat in the 7 Years' War. Britain had humiliated them, seizing territory and crushing their influence in North America. Now, for the French, history whispered a chance at revenge. Help the Americans, weaken the British, rewrite the balance of power. But France would not gamble on a losing cause. The Americans first had to prove they could stand and fight, not just talk of freedom, but bleed for it. The Battle of Saratoga, 1,777 inches, the forests of New York. The British launched a plan to cut the colonies in two, but American forces, dug in and determined, met them head-on at Saratoga. Against expectation, the Americans won. It was not just a victory on the battlefield, it was a victory of perception. To the watching world, Saratoga said, "This revolution can succeed." And that changed everything. France steps out of the shadows with Saratoga as proof. France made its decision. In 1778, France officially recognized the United States of America. Soon after, a formal alliance was born. French money, French soldiers, French naval power, all were pledged to the American cause. The revolution now had what it desperately needed: supplies, ships, and a partner. Hope that once flickered now burned brighter. The war was no longer Britain against 13 colonies. It was Britain against a growing coalition, ready to challenge an empire. A war transformed French involvement, widened the conflict. British resources were stretched. New fronts opened across the globe. And America, for the first time, could imagine victory not as a distant prayer, but as a real horizon. Yet the war was not over, not even close. Blood still had to be spilled, battles still had to be fought, and one decisive moment still waited at the end of a long and bitter road. But now, the Americans were no longer alone. The revolution had allies. It had momentum. It had belief. And soon, it would have its final triumph at a place called Yorktown. By 1781, the long war had taken its toll. Fields were burned, cities scarred, families scattered. Washington's army was exhausted, but unbroken. Britain still believed that victory was only a matter of time. They held major ports, they controlled the seas, and their forces in the South were commanded by a confident general, Lord Charles Cornwallis. He believed the rebellion could be crushed from the south upward. He moved through the Carolinas and into Virginia, choosing the coastal town of Yorktown as his base. There, he waited for reinforcements. There, he expected safety, with the mighty Royal Navy at his back. But events were turning against him. History was closing in. Washington's bold gamble. General Washington saw an opening, a chance to trap Cornwallis and end the war in a single stroke. He acted with speed and secrecy. Instead of attacking New York, as the British expected, Washington moved his army south. Marching hundreds of miles, he joined forces with the French General Rochambeau on land and Admiral de Grasse at sea. Together, they formed a trap. The French Navy sealed off the Chesapeake Bay. British ships could not break through. Cornwallis could not escape. Yorktown became a cage. The siege. In September and October of 1781, American and French forces tightened their grip around Yorktown. Day by day, they dug trenches, brought up artillery, and rained fire upon British defenses. The thunder of cannons shook the earth. Smoke choked the air. Night skies burned red. Inside the British lines, supplies dwindled. Hope collapsed. Cornwallis understood the truth. No rescue was coming. The surrender on the 19th of October 1781, Cornwallis surrendered his army. British drums played a song called "The World Turned Upside Down." Because it had, the mightiest empire on earth had been defeated by a nation that did not yet fully exist. Washington did not cheer. He simply removed his hat and accepted the moment with solemn dignity. The war was not officially over, but the fighting was finished. Yorktown broke Britain's will. Peace negotiations began, and the dream of independence, once fragile and uncertain, was now unstoppable. A new dawn. Across the colonies, church bells rang. Crowds wept and embraced. The impossible had happened. What began as protest had become a revolution. What began as a rebellion had become a victory. The United States was now a reality, not on paper, not in speeches, but on the battlefield of history. Ahead lay the challenge of building a nation from the ashes of war. The fight for freedom was ending. The fight for identity was about to begin. The war was over. The British were gone. Independence was won, but victory did not bring order. The United States had freedom, but not structure. 13 former colonies, now 13 independent states, were bound together by the weak Articles of Confederation. There was no strong central government, no unified currency, no power to tax, no clear leadership. The states quarreled. Debts soared. Merchants suffered. Veterans went unpaid. The revolution had won a country, but could not yet run one. If America failed now, there would be no second chance. The dream of liberty would collapse under its own weight. And so, in 1787, leaders of the new nation gathered once more in Philadelphia. The building was small. The moment was enormous. This was the Constitutional Convention, a room of giants inside Independence Hall. Some of the greatest minds of the age took their seats. George Washington, chosen to preside, a steady symbol of unity. James Madison, small in size but vast in thought, the architect of new ideas. Benjamin Franklin, old, wise, a living bridge between generations. They did not come to revise the old system. They came to replace it, to create something stronger, something lasting, something that could hold a nation together. Debate and division arguments filled the room. Large states wanted representation by population. Small states demanded equality. Some feared tyranny. Others feared chaos. Voices clashed. Compromises formed. 2 houses in Congress, one based on population, one based on equal votes for every state. A president, but limited by law. Courts to interpret that law. And above it all, a constitution that belonged not to a king, not to a parliament, but to the people. A government of checks and balances. 3 branches, each restrained by the others. Power divided so that freedom could endure. A nation under law. When their work was done, Franklin was asked, "What have we created?" He replied, "A republic if you can keep it." For he knew the truth. Writing liberty is easy. Keeping liberty is hard. The Constitution was signed not as a perfect document, but as a living framework. A foundation strong enough to support generations yet unborn. The Bill of Rights. To protect individual freedom, the first 10 amendments were added. The Bill of Rights. Freedom of speech. Freedom of religion. Freedom of the press. The right to assemble. The right to petition. The rights of the people set in ink. To stand against any tyranny, foreign or domestic. The framework endures with the Constitution. The United States finally became more than a rebellion, and more than a dream. It became a nation of laws, guided by ideals, balanced by structure, anchored by liberty. The war had created independence. The Constitution created America. Ahead lay expansion, conflict, opportunity, and challenge, but now the nation had a spine, a government, and a shared identity. The Republic was young, stronger than before, ready for what history would bring. And what came next was a horizon of land, a continent waiting to be crossed. With a constitution in place and a government finally forming, the young United States turned its eyes west. Beyond the Appalachian Mountains lay forests, rivers, plains, and possibilities as wide as imagination itself. To many Americans, the continent felt like destiny, a future waiting to be claimed. They believed that freedom was not just something to hold, but something to expand. The idea would one day gain a name, manifest destiny. But even before the term existed, the impulse was alive. The Louisiana Purchase 1803 opportunity arrived in 1803. France, under Napoleon Bonaparte, controlled a vast territory west of the Mississippi, the Louisiana Territory. He needed money for war in Europe. The United States needed room to grow. President Thomas Jefferson made a bold move. For $15 million, the United States purchased land that doubled the size of the nation overnight. From the Gulf of Mexico to the Great Plains, a continent opened. Maps had to be redrawn. Minds had to expand. Dreams had to grow. To explore this new land, Jefferson sent Lewis and Clark, who traveled west with a small expedition, guided in part by a young Shoshone woman, Sacagawea. They crossed mountains, rivers, and endless wilderness, returning with maps, notes, and proof of a vast frontier. The West was no longer rumor. It was real. A new American energy. Farmers sought fertile soil. Traders followed rivers. Pioneers packed wagons and chased opportunity. New states joined the Union. New towns rose from forests and plains. But expansion carried a cost. Two truths of the frontier. Truth 1. The West offered freedom, land, and hope to millions of settlers. Truth 2. That same expansion brought displacement, suffering, and broken promises to many native nations. The frontier was not only a place of possibility, it was a place of conflict. Cultures collided, treaties were made, and too often betrayed. The story of America's growth would be both inspiring and tragic. But in this moment, in the early 1800s, the young nation surged forward with unstoppable momentum. The frontier became a symbol of courage, of risk, of ambition, and of a belief that America's future stretched as wide as the horizon. A nation in motion. By the mid-19th century, the United States was no longer a fragile experiment on the Atlantic coast. It was a country of farmers, merchants, dreamers, and pioneers, spreading across a continent. Growth brought strength. Strength brought confidence. Confidence brought new challenges. For underneath the expansion, a moral and political storm was quietly building. A question, darker than any frontier thundercloud, waited on the horizon. Could a nation built on liberty survive, while half of it accepted slavery? That question would not stay quiet for long. As the nation expanded westward, a shadow stretched with it. A question followed every new territory, every new state, every new star added to the flag. Would this land be free, or would it allow slavery? The founders had won independence, but they had also left behind an unresolved contradiction. They had declared that all men are created equal, yet millions of enslaved Africans remained in chains. For decades, America tried to avoid the question, tried to compromise, tried to postpone the inevitable. But some questions do not disappear when ignored. They grow. Two Americas. By the mid-1800s, the United States had become two different countries in one. In the north, industry grew. Cities expanded. Railroads stitched states together. Paid labor and immigration fueled a rising economy. In the south, vast plantations spread across fertile soil. Cotton became king. Wealth flowed upward to a few, built painfully on the backs of many. Enslaved men, women, and children had no rights, no freedom, no say in their own lives. The North and South no longer lived the same reality. They no longer wanted the same future. Compromise and collapse leaders in Congress tried again and again to hold the Union together. The Missouri Compromise. The Compromise of 1850. Each deal bought time but solved nothing. Debates turned to shouting. Shouting turned to violence. Blood was spilled in bleeding Kansas, where pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers fought for control of the frontier. The nation trembled as the center weakened. A moral line is drawn. Then, in 1852, a book shook the nation's conscience. Uncle Tom's Cabin, by Harriet Beecher Stowe. It awakened emotions that statistics and speeches never could. It made millions ask what kind of country America truly wanted to be. Soon after, a tall lawyer from Illinois stepped into the national spotlight. His name was Abraham Lincoln. He spoke with clarity and conviction. He warned that a house divided against itself cannot stand. The issue could no longer be smoothed over, papered over, or pushed aside. America would have to choose. The breaking point. In 1860, Lincoln was elected president. The South believed their way of life was under threat. One by one, Southern states seceded, breaking away from the Union to form a new nation, the Confederate States of America. What compromise could remain after a nation tore itself in half? The United States, less than a century old, faced its greatest test. Not from a foreign empire, but from within. Brothers would soon face brothers. States would face states. And the ideals of the revolution would be questioned in blood. The time for debate was over. The time for war had come. The Union had broken. The experiment of 1776 now faced its greatest trial. not by invasion, not by foreign kings, but by its own divided heart. In April 1861, the first cannon roared at Fort Sumter, and the Civil War began. What followed was not a distant conflict in some far corner of the world. It was fought in fields and farms, in towns and rail lines, across rivers and valleys where Americans lived, worked, and prayed. This was not a war of strangers. It was brother against brother, neighbor against neighbor, state against state, a nation at war with itself, two flags, two visions, one land. The Union, led by President Abraham Lincoln, fought to preserve the United States. The Confederacy, led by Jefferson Davis, fought for independence and to preserve a way of life built on slavery. The Union had the advantage: more factories, more people, more railroads, and greater resources. The Confederacy had resolve fighting on its own soil, with gifted generals like Robert E. Lee, and a belief that courage could outweigh numbers. Both sides believed they were defending the true spirit of America, but only one vision could survive. A long and bloody struggle. Battles erupted across the South: Bull Run, Shiloh, Antietam, Gettysburg. The names would become etched into the American memory. Thousands died in a single day, sometimes in a single hour. The war swallowed sons and husbands, farmers and students, soldiers in blue and soldiers in gray. The cost was staggering, the pain immeasurable. Yet Lincoln held to a single purpose: the Union must endure. For if a nation built on liberty could be undone by secession, then liberty itself would forever be fragile. A new purpose emerges. At first, the North fought only to restore the Union, but as the war dragged on, another cause rose to the surface, a cause that had always been waiting beneath the arguments and compromises: freedom for the enslaved. Lincoln began to see the war not just as a battle for unity, but a battle for human equality. Soon, he would make a decision that would transform the conflict from a political struggle into a moral one. A decision that would redefine the meaning of America and the direction of the war. Ahead waited the Emancipation Proclamation, the turning point in the nation's soul. War reveals truth, and as the Civil War raged on, one truth became impossible to escape. The nation could not be saved unless its soul was saved too. Slavery was not a side issue. It was the core, the wound, the contradiction that bled beneath every battle. President Abraham Lincoln understood this. If the Union won without ending slavery, the victory would be hollow. The nation would remain divided in spirit, even if it were unified on paper. So Lincoln made a choice that would change the war, change the nation, and change history. A new purpose. On the 1st of January, 1863, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. With a stroke of ink, he declared that enslaved people in all Confederate territory were forever free. The war now had two missions: save the Union, end slavery. The battlefield was no longer just about land, it was about human dignity. Freedom was no longer a dream, it was policy, it was purpose. A world reacts. The proclamation echoed far beyond America. It denied the Confederacy any hope of foreign alliance. No European power would now support a government fighting to defend slavery. The world was watching, and history had taken a side. At home, thousands of enslaved men, women, and children fled to Union lines, seeking the promise that Lincoln had spoken aloud. Many would go further, joining the Union Army to fight for their own freedom. The struggle was no longer fought for them, it was now fought with them. The cause of liberty belonged to all who believed in it. A harder road, a brighter flame. The proclamation did not end slavery overnight. It did not end the war, and it did not erase the suffering. But it lit a fire that nothing could extinguish. It transformed the Union Army from a force fighting for reunion into a force fighting for rebirth. For the first time, the United States marched forward with a mission worthy of its founding words: all men are created equal. Lincoln's burden. Lincoln knew the cost: Freedom would demand sacrifice. Victory would demand endurance. And the war would get worse before it got better. But he also knew this. If America was ever to stand united again, it must be united not by law alone, but by principle. The proclamation was not the end of slavery, but it was the turning of the tide. From this moment on, there was no going back. The Union would fight on not only to save a nation, but to redeem it. The Civil War had dragged into its third year. Exhaustion spread on both sides. But neither the Union nor the Confederacy was willing to surrender the future. Then came a battle that would decide more than territory. It would decide destiny. The place was a quiet Pennsylvania town named Gettysburg. The date? July 1863. For 3 days, storm clouds of war gathered over its hills and fields. The Clash General Robert E. Lee, seeking a decisive victory on northern soil, marched his army into Pennsylvania. If the Confederacy could break the Union's will, perhaps the North would sue for peace. Perhaps the Confederacy would stand forever. The Union Army, under General George Meade, moved to stop him. On July 1st, the armies collided. What began as a chance encounter grew into a massive struggle, the largest battle ever fought on American land. 3 days of horror day. 1. Chaos. Lines collapsing. Gettysburg swallowed by fire and fear. Day 2. Little Round Top. A desperate stand by Union soldiers, holding the high ground against wave after wave of assault. Day 3. Lee gambled everything on a frontal attack across open fields. 12,000 Confederate soldiers marched in formation toward the Union center. The world would remember it as Pickett's charge. Artillery roared. Rifles tore through the air. The field became a sea of smoke and suffering. When the charge failed, Lee's army was forced to retreat. The Confederacy would never again regain the initiative. Gettysburg had broken its momentum. The cost. When the guns finally fell silent, the numbers were staggering. Over 50,000 casualties in just 3 days. Fathers, sons, friends. Americans lost to a war fought among brothers. Gettysburg became holy ground. A place of grief. A place of memory. A place where the price of union was carved into the earth. The Gettysburg Address months later, President Abraham Lincoln traveled to the battlefield to dedicate a cemetery for the fallen. He spoke for only 2 minutes. Just 272 words. No shouting, no boasting, no anger, only purpose. He reminded the nation that the war was not only about territory or victory or power, it was about whether a nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal could endure. He ended with a vow: that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. In that moment, Lincoln gave the war its soul. A turning of the tide. Gettysburg did not end the Civil War, but it ended the Confederacy's hope of breaking the Union by force. From that battlefield forward, the question was no longer if the Union could survive, but how much it would cost to finish the fight. Ahead waited one final year of agony, one final push toward freedom, one final march to reunite the nation. The Union would hold, but the victory and its price were not yet complete. The end was near, but the suffering was not. After Gettysburg, the Confederacy was wounded, bleeding, retreating, struggling to survive. Yet the war continued, town by town, field by field, year by year. General Ulysses S. Grant rose as the Union's relentless commander. Where others hesitated, Grant pushed forward. He believed in one simple truth: do not stop, do not turn back, end the war. Sherman's March. In the West, General William Tecumseh Sherman took the fight deep into Confederate territory. He marched from Atlanta to the sea, breaking railroads, burning supply lines, shattering the South's ability to wage war. Sherman was ruthless in strategy, but his mission was clear: make war so terrible that the South would never seek it again. His march split the Confederacy in two, and the end drew closer. Richmond falls. By early 1865, Grant closed in on Richmond, the Confederate capital. After years of bloodshed, the Confederate government fled. The symbol of rebellion had fallen. The Union, bruised but unbroken, tightened its grasp on victory. Appomattox, April 1865 inches. A quiet Virginia town called Appomattox Courthouse. The final moment arrived. General Robert E. Lee, knowing the cause was lost, met General Grant to surrender the Army of Northern Virginia. There were no cheers, no taunts, no triumphal shouts. Grant refused to humiliate his enemy. Instead, he offered dignity, allowing Confederate soldiers to return home with their horses and their honor. The war that tore a nation apart was finally ending. Lincoln's last battle piece was within reach. The Union had survived. Freedom had advanced. The American experiment had endured its greatest test. But even as the nation breathed at last, fate delivered its cruelest blow. On the 14th of April 1865, just days after the surrender, President Abraham Lincoln was shot by an assassin at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. He died the next morning. The man who saved the Union, who carried its burden on his shoulders, did not live to see the peace he had fought for. The nation wept. Church bells tolled. Cities fell silent. Freedmen wept openly in the streets, knowing the hand that signed their freedom was gone. America had won the war but lost the leader who gave it purpose. After the storm, the Civil War ended slavery. It preserved the Union, but it left wounds that would take generations to heal. The task ahead was enormous. Rebuild the South, reunite the states, restore the nation, and redefine freedom for all Americans. This period would be called Reconstruction. It would be turbulent, it would be imperfect, but it would be the bridge between war and restoration. The flag still flew, the Union still stood, the nation had survived its darkest night, and soon it would rise toward a new dawn, a country reborn. The Civil War had ended. The Union was saved. Slavery was abolished. But victory in war did not mean peace in the heart. A shattered South lay in ruins. Cities burned. Economies collapsed. Homes turned to ash. Families mourned their dead on both sides of the line. The nation had survived, but it was broken. Now came a new struggle. Reconstruction. Not of buildings, but of a country. The hope of a new America. Millions of newly freed men and women took their first steps in freedom. They searched for work. They searched for family. They searched for identity in a country they helped build but had never been allowed to claim. Schools were founded. Churches rose. Freedmen voted, held office, and dreamed boldly for the very first time. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments rewrote the meaning of citizenship. Freedom was now law. Equality was now promised. The Constitution had gained new life and a new moral compass. The struggle to heal. But healing was not simple. Some Southerners resisted change. Old hatred clung to the land. Violence and intimidation spread through dark corners of the defeated states. Reconstruction governments worked to rebuild the South and protect black rights. But progress was slow, and backlash was fierce. The nation battled itself again, not with armies, but with ideas, votes, and memory. Yet even through struggle, one truth stood firm. The United States would not be torn apart again. A new union. A new identity. As years passed, the wounds slowly began to close. Railroads linked coast to coast. Cities rose from ruin. Immigrants arrived in waves, bringing labor, culture, innovation, and a belief that America was the land of possibility. The West called to pioneers. Industry sparked in the North. Cotton fields revived in the South now, with free labor and a different future. The United States was becoming not just a union of states, but a union of people diverse, determined, and forward-looking. The Arc of the Friend story. From 13 colonies to a continental nation. From protest to revolution. From independence to constitution. From slavery to emancipation. From civil war to national rebirth. America had been tested by fire, division, and doubt, and still it endured. The founding promise was not perfect, not complete, not fully realized, but it was alive. A nation still becoming the United States did not emerge from Reconstruction as a flawless nation. It emerged as a free one, unfinished, imperfect, but unbroken. Its story would continue through triumphs and trials, across generations yet to come, because the true idea of America was never just a moment in history. It was, and remains, a journey. A journey toward justice, a journey toward equality, a journey toward a more perfect union, a nation built not on bloodlines, but on belief, not on conquest, but on conviction, not on kings, but on the people. Final lines. Epilogue. From wilderness to republic, from rebellion to rebirth, the United States rose, chapter by chapter, forged by courage, conflict, faith, and hope. And through every struggle, its greatest power was never the sword, but the idea that freedom belongs to all. The story is not over. It never was. It never will be. Because a nation, like its people, is always becoming. This is the story of America's beginning. The rest is still being written.